50 years ago today, September 13th, 1971, the Attica Rebellion occurred. 43 people lost their lives. 33 incarcerated men, 10 correction officers. Let's take a moment in the spirit of libation, in the spirit of honoring ancestors, to remember that day and to remember all of those whose lives were lost. When the rebellion happened, September 13th, 1971, I was in prison on Rikers Island. We watched in fascination on a black and white television, knowing that this could easily have been us. We saw brilliant organization, a brilliant articulation by the prison leaders. We saw people of conscience gather outside the prison. And for a moment, there was hope that this would reach a victorious end and a peaceful end. And then the unimaginable happened. Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered the National Guard to retake the prison, and beyond just retaking the prison, to come in with gun blazing. And as we recognized in the beginning of the program, 43 people lost their lives. It is in this spirit that we talk about the prison abolition movement. We talk about what we need to do today, but there's so much to learn from our speakers and from our panelists to give us context for how Attica came to be and came to pass in the first place. It is a real honor to welcome our first speaker, Angela Davis. Sister Professor Dr. Angela Davis is a long-distance revolutionary. She is a scholar, a teacher, an organizer, a beacon of what liberation struggle is about. She is the founder of Critical Resistance and a leader of the worldwide movement for prison abolition. Please welcome Sister Angela Davis.
I think in CBL and all of the sponsoring organizations that have come together on this historic anniversary of the Attica Uprising. As I reflect on this moment, remembering the confluence of profound sadness and hopefulness with respect to the future, it is more apparent than ever that Attica is indeed all of us. I remember my own unmitigated grief when the news of George Jackson's death at the hands of San Quentin prison guards reached me in my Marin County jail cell, and how weeks later, hundreds of imprisoned men in Attica demonstrated that despite the status of unfreedom to which they had been relegated, they could collectively call for an emancipatory future. As they embodied the radical organizing within prisons throughout the country, they wanted better conditions of life behind walls. But more importantly, they linked their struggles with the revolutionary movements of the time, inside this country as well as in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Most importantly for us in the US, 50 years after the Attica uprising, we realize how that moment enabled and foreshadowed a decades-long struggle for recognition of the US prison system and of its allied policing agencies as the most persistent and the most forceful examples of the structural racism that was made dramatically evident by the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the spring of last year. From the ranks of the Attica protesters echoed the very first public calls of that era for abolition. Our efforts today to abolish prisons and policing would not have evolved as they have without the catalytic impact of the Attica uprising. Frank Big Black Smith was one of the pivotal figures in the uprising. He was the head of security for the protesters. I had the privilege of working with this phenomenal human being after his release in 1973, when he joined the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression and served as the point person for our work to free the Attica brothers. Parenthetically, I later discovered that Miss Major, one of the important leaders of the movements for trans rights, was deeply influenced by her encounter with Big Black when she herself was in prison. But perhaps this is not such a parenthetical observation when we consider that, aside from trans struggles, so many other radical movements were ultimately enabled by the histories that Attica spawned. Big Black himself said in an interview in the documentary Ghosts of Attica, Attica is not just an isolated prison. Attica is attitudes and behavior, crime and punishment, education. It's about communication. It's about alleviating racism as much as we can. It's about the criminal justice system. It's about how the police can do what they want to when they want to do it. Attica is all of us.
It is my honor to introduce to you Danny Glover, whom most of you know as an actor. But Danny Glover is not only an actor, he is an activist. He is rooted out of activism, and he is also our Alliance of Families for Justice board chair.
Thank you so much. And I am so honored to be here as we remember the atrocious moments that occurred 50 years ago at Attica State Prison. And I think it's important to understand the larger context of that moment as well, as our sister Angela Davis so wonderfully spoke about in her comments. You know, the U.S. back then, as it continues to be, is in war not only with its own citizens, but other citizens, other people of color around the world. As we look at the larger context that happened at that particular point, the attempt to crush the Black Panther Party at that particular point in time, so the internal resistance that was happening here found its way also in other places such as Attica as well. We are reminded that race is still a dominant predictor of being incarcerated in America. We are reminded that we must expand the public policy demands to defund and re-envision public safety and security, to include public demands for community review and reconstruction of the horrid living conditions of the millions of imprisoned across this country. Although there are official state, New York State, investigation into why the Attica uprising had happened, the trauma experienced by the men in Attica and their family has never been acknowledged by the state. We must never forget the legacy of Attica and the sacrifices made by the men there to draw worldwide attention to the humane conditions in which they were subjected. We must all care about what happens to our fellow human beings and commit ourselves to doing something about it, like the speakers during this two-day event. Even 50 years ago, after this horrific and racist events at Attica, activists around the world are in this country continue to use Attica as the rebellion as a clarion call to the work that has to be done to sustain the struggle for justice. The 50th anniversary remembrance of this courageous effort of the inhumanity treated incarcerated black and brown men in Attica who demanded humane treatment should call us all, the citizens and politicians, to recommit and continue include prison in the public policy call to implement community control over police and prisons. Attica is all of us. Attica means fight back. Thank you.
As Fela Kuti would say, let us come into this room to do what we came here to do. I'm going to say the names of these wonderful people who you all have the honor of seeing on this Zoom landscape. So Iisha Hamilton Stevens, Antonio Yarbough, Emani Davis, and Pearl Smith. So let's open it up. I would love for each one of you all to do an introductory piece. And how about Emani? I just saw you click your mic on first. So if you don't mind, please start us off.
So my name is Emani Davis. I'm the daughter of Attica brother Jomo Davis. I do have an organization named after my dad, the Omowale Project, after my dad, Jomo Omowale. We do focus on intergenerational healing of trauma. We focus very heavily on trauma rooted in the body, and it obviously definitely comes from my relationship to my dad, whom I cared for until the end of his life in 2017. And I think is very connected to the work of Attica. I'm just humbled and privileged to be able to be alive and well enough to participate in the commemoration of 50 years since the Attica uprising. And I feel very blessed to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much, Emani. Iisha.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Iisha Hamilton, and I'm the wife of a current incarcerated man at Attica Correctional Facility. Currently, my husband is serving a 40-year to life sentence, and we have been together for 11 years. And I'm here basically just to share our experience of what Attica has been for us, as he's been there at various points throughout his incarceration. And I'm just here to share my story, share our story, and understanding that Attica is all of us, and we are here.
Thank you so much, Iisha. Antonio.
Hello, everybody. My name is Antonio Yarbough. I spent 20 years in Attica for a crime I had absolutely nothing to do with. So I'm an advocate for wrongful conviction. I'm also a co-founder with AFJ, Alliance of Families for Justice. Me and Ms. Sophia Elijah started it together. And I sit on the board with Danny Glover. I'm here to talk about the things that I experienced while being in Attica. And after being exonerated in 2014, to talk about the things that still need to change in Attica, because I still have a lot of brothers that are still up there.
Thank you, Antonio. Pearl Smith, please.
My name is Pearl Smith. I'm the wife of Frank Big Black Smith, who survived the Attica uprising in 1971. I'm here to talk about the work that he done. For 26 years, he worked tirelessly to let the world know that he did not want Attica State Prison and the guards and everyone that had participated in the uprising. He said, I don't want them to get away with this. That was one of his main topics when he talked. He said, and then he also said, but when he was laying on the table, he said, I can't believe that I'm in America. So I'm here to let everyone know that the struggle continues. There's not been too much change. So I'm here on behalf of Frank to say his piece and my piece.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pearl. Antonio, could you further dive into what's important for you to say? What's important for you to talk about?
I would just start it off like this. I've never been incarcerated on a crime. I've never been inside of a juvenile detention center. Never been inside of a prison until 1992. I discovered the body of my mother, my sister, and my cousin. And I called the cops thinking that they would help me. And what happened, they turned on me without going into a long story. And I wind up getting charged for the crime of murdering my mother, sister, and cousin. I wound up spending 2 years on Rikers Island fighting them, trying to prove my innocence on Rikers Island fighting them. Finally, after a second trial, I was sentenced to 75 years to life, and I was sent to Attica. So I just want you to think of a 17-year-old being convicted of such a heinous crime, and then at the age of 19 being shipped up to Attica. That's my first stop, was Attica Correctional Facility, where they kept me there for 20 years until I was able to prove my innocence. You get a really rude awakening the moment you step into. Now, I haven't been to any other jail but Attica for 20 years, where I spent 20 years in Attica. And my first welcome to Attica was, I was on my way to the gym after getting off of quarantine, and they had a captain, the captain bars on his shirt, a white shirt, with his sleeve rolled up, with a black baby with a noose tied around his neck, hanging from his arm. And that was my welcome to Attica moment. And the first time I ever heard, I come out of Brooklyn, New York, the first time I ever heard a white person say the N-word was Attica. Another shocker for me. I had a lot of shocking experience being in Attica. And the longer I stood there, kept at Attica, I started to realize that they're just punishing us for something. And I couldn't understand what they was punishing us for. And, thank God for the older brothers up there. They started explaining to me about the Attica riot and a lot of things that the brothers fought for. They was vividly trying to take it back. Like they was doing their best to take everything back from us. So any little incident, would cause mayhem. I was there when, a friend of mine who was going home, and the police allow, some gang members to jump on him and kill him in the middle of the yard, right after he sent his family on the visiting floor, where he had to lay on in A-block yard forever, and you hear them joking about it. You go down to the package room and, your family done worked hard, they done saved up their money and sent you a package, and, you come back with half of your package. And if you complain, you might not come back with it at all. I wrote grievances, friends wrote grievances, family members write, lawyers get involved, they write. So Albany knows what's going on. All the politicians up there know what's going on. Attica's batting 1,000 for, it's always inmates assaulting officers. And come on. 100 out of 100 times, but this is the story they tell. They're afraid of us all of a sudden. But they were tying a noose around us so much, it's like basically hard to breathe. But somebody being, like for me, 75 years of life, why are you nitpicking with me about the littlest things? Why are you beefing me about an extra roll of toilet paper? Why are you got my visit waiting for me, and they come from all the way from the 5 boroughs, and you got my family sitting down there, my grandmother, 80-something years old, sitting down on the visiting floor. It's a lot of stuff that, and it's the little things that eventually is going to pile up into big things. And it not only affects the person that's there, it affects the family members that's there that want to see their loved ones, but can't say too much, afraid their loved ones might get beat down or killed.
Thank you for giving me the weather gauge, all right? But that thing you said, that they were taking away things that had been gained. Here you were in the 90s. That was in the 70s. And still the same things are happening now.
It's happening now. You get on the phone and talk to friends of mine.
So I want to shift to Emani. How did you come to find out about your father and what he had to experience?
My first introduction to Attica was a very non-detailed story. I would say that as a little girl, I loved to rub what I thought was, I would call it the gravel, this very smooth, like burned part of the inner part of my father's left arm. And on visits, I would rub that, and I loved that smooth piece of skin. It would be probably 20 years later before I would understand that that was buckshot residue from the first shot that he took in Attica. He then was shot 5 more times in the yard. I think it's important, and we talked about this in our preparation, my father was very careful and conscious about not overly exposing me to the trauma and to the things that were endured by him and his brothers at Attica. I think that what was highlighted for me was that oppressed people have the right and the duty to retaliate, to fight, fight the very systems that oppress them, and that people, regardless of choices that they may make, are human beings and have dignity and the right to be treated fairly and with respect. And I think that was foundational to the philosophy of our upbringing. And I know that I always felt very proud that I felt like him and 2,100 other men were willing to come together and risk life and limb to make sure that the world understood that position. And I think that since his transition in 2017, I've been much more focused on kind of understanding the spiritual component of what happened that day, because I think that it's hard for family members to just sit with the damage, like the physical carnage piece, but to want to, and knowing that so much continues to be wrong at Attica, right? And not wanting to feel like their lives and their work was in vain. I think that I focus heavily on what I call the harmonic convergence of that day, that men who were not even politicized prior to that. I mean, my dad came into Attica from Auburn already a Panther, but for many of the men in that yard, that was an awakening of their politics and of their consciousness. And I appreciate moments like this where we can look at all of it, both the harm that's being caused, but also maintain the respect for the legacy that was left.
My loved one is currently housed at Attica. And when I think of Attica, I think of fear. As you said, Yao, to Emani, she wasn't born when the Attica riots occurred, and neither was my husband and I. My husband has been in Attica at various points throughout his incarceration, and him being housed in Attica prior to the cameras, I can tell you that he would tell me of the violence that he would see. So the trauma of it all is frightening. You know, when my husband first went to Attica, he was in his early 20s, and just, the history of Attica, it was very frightening for him. He was afraid, not knowing, will he survive this, environment? It's like, what do we do as family members? How do we support our loved ones? Specifically for me, my fight is the mental health. And I'm not talking about mental health from a stance of what is the norm of schizophrenia or, clinical mental health. I'm talking about trauma, anxiety, depression. These impacted, incarcerated individuals need help. This is the words that haunt me daily that I hear my husband say, I just need help. I need help. I need to talk to someone. And for me, that's why I'm here, to share there's no help.
Mrs. Smith, Pearl, you met Frank later on. You want to talk just a little bit about his well-being and anything you want to say around that?
So for us, it was taking the film, and he went all over the United States with the film on speaking engagements. So for us, it was a lot of work for 26 years because he stayed at it. He did not light up at all. He always talked about, I'm not going to let them get away with this. And so he worked tirelessly. And what the best part of it is that the brothers kept their solidarity together. They stayed focused. They did work, and they pulled together, and they didn't let nothing come between them as to the fight that they had ahead of them during the time or with the indictments, and then after the indictments, they still had to go back into court for funds. And so it was a lot of work, but he worked tirelessly. And if anyone would call that law office and say they wanted to have their brief reread or any kind of way that they could find something wrong with their case where they could come out of prison, Liz Fink and Frank and the other lawyers, they worked on that. They didn't turn anybody down. Meeting him and learning about his life before and after prison, it was my duty not as a wife, but as my duty as a person to support what he was doing because it needed to be done.
I want to invite Emani in. What was that love between father and daughter? What helped to sustain that, given the experiences?
I think that one of the most beautiful things one of the only positive things about physical separation through incarceration is that we figure out how to love in very creative ways. And we figure out how to feel connected, and it becomes a main focus, right? Because you feel like it is a defiant act to still figure out how to be connected and how to love and how to maintain. And, for my dad, and I know this is true for the family of Big Black, it's like we've all felt this duty to maintain their presence in the street. And so I think that I was always very hungry to learn more and understand more. I always loved to be around Black and Akil and the brothers Shasha and Shuja, all these other brothers that I got to grow up around. I love just literally absorbing them. For me, that was it. It's feeling like you can carry parts of them with you. And learning how to do that. And, on visits, my dad always greeted each other by nose to nose, which I found out later was there's many tribes all over the New Zealand and the Maori, and there's other people that do that. But we just literally would inhale each other. And he did that with all of us. And as he was transitioning, I continued to do the same thing. And I realized that it wasn't really about scent, but energy, and you maintain it with your memory. And the beauty of the body is that even what the mind forgets, the body remembers. And we focus on trauma, but we could focus on the love and the healing and the wisdom too, right? That's the importance of the ancestral memory, right? Is they feed us that all we pass from generation is trauma. That's not true, right? Even in slaves' times, we were still making love and having babies and getting married and reading stories and cooking. Yes. There was always was always a part of our culture. And in prison, the same is true. All of those things still occur, even when people are separated by bars. And I think I should say that one of the things, and I know we're focused on nothing changing, but New York State is one of the only states in the country that has 7-day-a-week full contact visiting, has the family reunion program with the overnight visits. That came from Attica. That came from the demand of access. And so even though many of the conditions haven't changed, I've worked in California state prisons, I've worked in many other state prisons all over the country, and most places don't have that.
Yes. So thank you so much for invoking that. I want you all to speak about this tremendous drive that these men had to continue doing the work?
I think that they all felt responsible in a very real way for those who were coming behind them and for and for one another. And they understood that they left many, many, many brothers and sisters behind the wall, and they knew that there was no voice for them. I think that their awareness of how bad it was and how silent and invisible they were. I think one of the beautiful things about Attica is that it blew the doors open. And I think that that's the responsibility of all of us, is to continue to bring the light into the darkest parts of our country and our world. And unfortunately, those places are prison. That is the darkest. And our loved ones are there.
She summed it all up in a nutshell. It's that it's not an obligation. You feel like you're obligated to do anything. It's just when you suffer that sense of hopelessness and that sense of no one cares, that sense of that, no matter what you try to do, they're always going to be right. When I got my turn to get out, it was like I said I have to pay it forward. I have to go up there. I have to speak up for these brothers.
The driven part was they knew that there was work to be done, and they knew if they didn't, they had to step up and do the work. And one thing Frank would always say, wake up, America.
Yes.
Nothing come to a sleeper but a dream. And so I say my hat goes off to all the brothers for the solidarity that they had among themselves.
Thank you, Ms. Pearl. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the way you opened up, the way you came linked together. It's been an honor. So I thank you very much.
Our next panel is moderated by Sister Heather Ann Thompson. She is a professor, scholar, historian, activist, an acclaimed author who was won the Bancroft Prize, the Pulitzer Prize for her book, Blood in the Water, The Attica Uprising of 1971.
I am so honored to be here tonight with this incredible panel of justice fighters in the moment, and also an Attica brother from the day who's still a justice fighter in the moment. And I want to introduce everybody who's going to be here on the panel today, and also someone who's going to join us, who's actually going to start us off on the panel tonight via a taped message from the inside. And that first person who's going to offer us a message is none other than Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mumia, as many of you already know, is an American political activist, a journalist, who we all came to know many, many decades now ago when he was reporting first primarily in Philadelphia on the MOVE activism against police brutality and many other things in the city of Philadelphia. And Mumia is going to be followed by Vivian Nixon. Vivian Nixon, I'm so delighted to see tonight here on the panel. Vivian is also a justice warrior, the executive director of College and Community Fellowship, an organization committed to removing individual and structural barriers to higher education for women with criminal record histories and their families. We're also going to hear from Angel Solis, the project director of the Youth Empowerment Project of the Alliance of Families for Justice. This is someone who comes to us born and raised in the Bronx, previously incarcerated himself, but also somebody who knows about the struggle on the inside and how to bring it home. Also somebody who knows about the power of education as struggle, the power of learning as liberation, graduating himself in 2021. So it's a sociology degree, Columbia University. And last, but by no means least, taking it full circle back to Attica, Sharif Alhajji, Attica brother, who I'm so deeply honored to have here with us, who we can hear from, learn from. But I'm going to stop talking because now I'm going to turn it over first to Mumia, and then some questions for our panelists to share with us all that we need to hear. So first, Mumia, everyone.
Attica's aftermath. For the young, those in their 20s and 30s, what meaning can the Attica Rebellion have when it fails to strum the strings of memory? It is ancient history, lost until we who lived in that era remind new generations of what happened there and its aftermath in crafting a system of mass incarceration. The Attica brothers demanded no retaliation or, in their own words, freedom from all physical, mental, and legal reprisals. Some wanted freedom, period, to be sent to other countries where they could live free of America itself. In letters sent to the Young Lords Party from their affiliates inside, known as the Inmate Liberation Front, came the most remarkable prescience. Historian Johanna Fernandez, in her 2020 award-winning work, The Young Lords, A Radical History, quotes the following from letters sent to the Young Lords from ILF members. Quote, "The pig is already talking about sacrificing the hostages to get to us. If possible, we are willing to leave the country if we're granted safe passage out. We are not Americans. We are Puerto Ricans and blacks. And as such, we do not belong in fascist America." Fernandez, 361. Attica's rebellion would be snuffed out by gunfire 5 days after its birth. This gunfire would come from state troopers under the command of Governor Nelson Rockefeller. In less than 15 minutes, 39 people, 29 prisoners, and 10 guards would be dead. A New York State commission would later note that the mass state killing at Attica was the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War. It has been 50 years, half a century, since the gunsmoke of the state killings at Attica. What has been revealed after the smoke cleared was how easily the state killed with impunity, and how the media transformed state lies after the massacre into news, blaming prisoners who had no firearms with the killings. Since Attica, the prison industrial complex has multiplied in ways that were unthinkable in 1971. Lifelong scholar Manning Marable, in his 2006 work, Living Black History, writes of what he calls, parenthetically, an unholy trinity of structural racism, mass unemployment, mass incarceration, and mass disenfranchisement. Marable writes, "The mass unemployment of the minority labor force has relegated vast populations into the informal and underground economies. The growth of informal and sometimes illegal economy has coincided with an unprecedented reliance on the criminal justice system, specifically penal institutions, to oppress, warehouse, and dehumanize racial minorities who have become unnecessary as producers in the formal labor market. Consequently, the millions of citizens who have been convicted of felonies have been eliminated, either temporarily or permanently, from meaningful civil participation." Marable, 45-46. There's another dimension to the post-Attica world. I call it the neoliberal disguise of repression. By that I mean, when Attica emerged, joints were called prisons. People in them were called prisoners. And those who worked there were called guards. The neoliberalism of the 80s and 90s changed the language. Prisons became correctional institutions. Prisoners became inmates. And guards became correctional officers. And while the language became neoliberalized, the realities became grimmer and more repressive. When Attica happened, there were no supermaxes. Solitary confinement was a rare phenomenon back then. Even prison sentences were significantly shorter. The rise of neoliberalism meant repression with a smile. Ultimately, however, despite its linguistics, was the reality of repression and mass incarceration on an unprecedented scale from imprisoned nations. This is Mumia, Abu-Jamal. Thank you.
So grateful to have the voice of Mumia. Angel, let me pivot to you with a question, if that's okay. in the same way that we sometimes we forget, I think, about the importance of how many women there are on the inside and their contribution really to this ongoing struggle for justice, we also really forget that all the way back at Attica and to this day, so many folks on the inside of Attica back in 1971 were youth, were really young people, 17, 18 years old, but putting their lives on the line to imagine a different justice future. Same thing is true today. This is what you talk about all the time. Can you tell us about the centrality of youth to both how we're going to change things, reimagine things today, but also, what you see on the ground?
The youth are important in every struggle, period, but they're uniquely and particularly impacted by this system of injustice because if you're young and you're Black or brown, you're more likely to be arrested, more likely to be sent to a correctional facility, and more likely to be killed by a police officer. In America, I mean, if you're a person of color, you're more likely to experience every negative eventuality in existence at a significantly higher rate. But being young and Black or brown means that a great historical hunt has started and that now that you are the target. And this is what happens statistically when you just add young and Black or young brown, you get these increases concerning contact with our nation's security forces. But the greater truth is that, like I said, every fight is their fight, as an oppression in one sphere results in an inevitable restriction of existence down the road in their lives. And ultimately, the youth vote on the future. Every generation either accepts the world they have inherited or rejected. And the youth usually answer the greatest question of all, which is continuity or revolution. When you're a toddler and you're a person of color, or you're in elementary school, your oppression has existed, you're just not really aware of it. But once you hit a certain age, once you become a teenager, the oppression becomes real. The police are after you. All sorts of things start happening. Because ultimately, we should remember that like the older generation has seen the rise of the surveillance state and the information age. However, these kids are born in it. This is their normal. So as the surveillance state has expanded, their ability to use that same tech to fight oppression has expanded with the enemy's expansion of these oppressive technologies. They use it for liberation. It was a teenage African-American that captured the images of George Floyd's murder, and those images set the world on fire. And they were used on the trial against the enemy. They're the first ones to pick up their phones and capture some act because they know viscerally that we need proof, especially when you're of color. And they must viscerally understand that even though they're not saying it, some of them might not even have the political language to express it, but they know that, these battles aren't won with firepower, but images that can pierce deeper than any bullet.
Thank you for that. It's so important to remember. And again, as I was saying, at Attica, so many of the men that put their lives on the line were such young men. So many of the men that led that struggle were so young at the time, as I know that Sharif is going to share with us in a moment. And back to Vivian now, so many women are part of this justice struggle. And incidentally, even though Attica was full of men, as we know, the 30-plus year justice struggle that came out of Attica, women were also instrumental, the women lawyers, the women that kept that struggle alive alongside the Attica brothers, Liz Fink, Liz Gaines. So many of the women were also essential to that struggle as well. So can you share with me importance of women to the justice struggle, both inside and outside?
African-American women have kind of been the holders of the trauma of generations and generations of men who were, of course, targeted by a racist, oppressive system because they pose a threat to the ongoing emergence of white supremacist dominance that has become the model that we're living under. And so women's involvement in every movement that we've seen, from abolition movements to escape movements to return to the motherland movements, has not been huge in numbers, but the presence has been integral and absolutely necessary in order to drive the conversation forward. Where Attica is concerned, we have to remember that every man that was in Attica had women in his life, mothers, sisters, spouses, daughters, nieces, who were, for the most part, holding them down and providing that support on the outside to keep them going through these horrific conditions, the neglect, the abuse, the being treated less than human. There are women languishing in prisons where the conditions are deteriorating almost to the extent of what the Attica riots were about. Places across the country where women are subjected to all kinds of abuse inside of these non-transparent institutions. So we are definitely a part of the fight for justice and the struggle, both outside and in. I have personally had the privilege of working in the past with people who survived Attica. And it's really, this is how insidious the American system of mass punishment is, and the stories of white supremacy. They stick with you when you're a child. I remember being a child in the 1970s, a teenager, 14 or 15 years old, and there was this big fat guy. It was my father's really good friend. He used to sit around the kitchen table and talk about being at the Attica riots and the fearing for his life in such a way that he literally grabbed a cooked turkey. He was working in the mess hall, hid under a table for days, and survived off of that turkey he was able to commandeer. Hearing a story like that when you're young, you know that your life is constantly under threat. And I try to connect social issues to one another. There's no wonder that our lives as Black people, as Black women, are being diminished year after year. In the last year of COVID, life expectancy in the United States went down by 1% for white men and white women, largely because of an age group that was impacted by COVID. But during that same period, it went down 3 times as much for Black men and Black women. So we are always under threat, whether it's being shot down like dogs in the yard at Attica, or whether it is some mysterious disease that is in the air. The white supremacist model of domination and power is also in the air we breathe. And women are here to stand with men, and we know that men stand with us as well.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you. And Sharif, to that point, to that story, can you share with us, as one of those men there on the 13th, can you share with us what, from your vantage point, having been there then, but also standing here now and knowing how that struggle 50 years ago today also so animates justice struggles today? What is some of the connective tissue, the way you're seeing it?
First, let me thank you for being here and being a part of this memorial. Actually, first I'd like to introduce myself as Brother Alhajji Sharif. And a year ago, myself doing the 49th memorial, I said that we needed an identity. We was just each year doing the memorials around the city. So myself with a few other brothers, we created the Attica Improvement Memorial Project to help memorialize the struggle that the brothers put up in Attica 50 years ago, a day that I didn't think that I would be here. From that idea, today we have these 2 days of remembrance and memorializing the brothers that put their lives on the line for what I would say, the human rights struggle behind the walls. One of the greatest tragedies that we're living through today is to see young children incarcerated at the age of 11, 12, 13 years old. Myself, I can speak to that narrative because of the fact that my first encounter with incarceration was at 11 years old. And what they refer to today, or most people don't know about, what's called the old youth house at Spofford. Here we are today, we're still speaking about prison life in America. Prison life in America just does not start when you become an adult. It's a narrative that's created, sometimes sadly say, within our school system. At one time within the system was called rehabilitation, and now it's called incarceration. That incarceration seems to me has become what I call the new plantation. It's become the mass incarceration system that now you see big companies vying to create prisons within their communities for slave labor, minor sources. That was some of the battles that was put up in Attica because of what we went through, the inhuman rights, the abuse of human rights, and not seeing us as human beings. And that one of the biggest things that narrative needs to change. That because you are incarcerated doesn't make you convicted, or doesn't make you illegally convicted, or doesn't make you committed a crime. It's sadly to see how a country as big as America, as productive as America, that we allow our children to be lost. Attica is all of us, and that's one of the biggest things that I love to hear, because as this old saying goes, that it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a village to destroy a child. Mm. So here we are. We have to find our ways to change the narrative that everyone that's incarcerated is guilty of a crime, and change the narrative of prison life. That was one of the reasons that I helped create and co-founded AIM, Attica Improvement Memorial Project, because my goal is to educate preteens to business and parenting skills, because I think that's one of the things that's missing out of the school system, that they got into more education, we call academics, but they forgot about how to socially motivate our children and socially motivate the parents. And we have a lot of young parents today, and that's due to the fact that we have a lot of young parents, we also lose the skills to how to motivate them. So Attica is all of us, and we all must be put a part of it and make a part of that change.
Thank you, Sharif. And it sounds to me like one of the key themes in what every single one of you has said is about the connective tissue of every member of this community being part of the same struggle. I want to go back to you, Vivian, and ask you, when you're thinking about today and you're thinking about the justice struggle, that's all that still needs to be done. It feels to a lot of folks that the needle's barely moved at all. What gives you hope that this justice struggle is moving forward, and what worries you that we need to look out for so that it does?
You know, ironically, what worries me and what gives me hope are flip sides of the same coin. Because I look at the history of Attica, the reluctance of some states to even provide basic health services to incarcerated people during the midst of a global health crisis, the ways in which we are in captivity, even when we are in our communities, in our streets, where we can have a succession of events that we saw in 2020 that are not unprecedented events, but our awareness of them became unprecedented because we were in a pandemic quarantine and we were forced to watch America be what America is. So what worries me is that after the rush of corporations that rose to the occasion, after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so forth, and started diversity and inclusion initiatives, the rush of philanthropists that wanted to suddenly fund racial justice initiatives. And every time we get to this point in our history where we are forced to confront America's violent birth, because the birth of America was a violent act, When we're forced to confront that, we shush it, we quiet it, we squelch it. And as soon as the streets calm down, it is back to racism as usual, punishment as usual, capitalism as usual. But I also have hope. When you have a 17-year-old girl who in a normal routine run to the convenience store can notice that there's a pretty common police interaction taking place. Looks like just a simple arrest, but her instinct told her this Black body is in danger and I can make sure that the world sees it. The bravery, the courage, the fortitude it took for her to stand there for 9 minutes and to film that. She will never be the same, but she exposed to the world the trauma that has been inflicted on us for centuries. So my hope is in the youth.
Amen to that. And can I follow up just really quick with one thing you said, Vivian? You said, can you speak a little bit also about so many folks coming home and being part of this movement? Because I feel like that's a key thing too, right? It isn't that everyone is just being spoken for anymore, right? Yeah.
But more and more organizations around the country are being led by people who have been released from prison, who have come out, who have started organizations. And if they haven't started organizations, they've joined coalitions. People are finally understanding that the power to change a system comes from those who are most harmed by that system, are put in positions to make decisions about public policy that impacts changing those systems.
Thank you, Vivian. And Sharif, can you share with us what your hope was this day, 50 years ago? Take us forward.
Well, it's simple. And they keep saying the same thing, the youth. 50 years ago, when in the D-Yard, when they was establishing the negotiating committee and picking the different brothers from the different blocks to be a part of the negotiating team, I said to myself, man, I should be on that. I came from Elmira. I was the minister in the Nation of Islam there, and I got wind up going to Elmira, so I said I should be on that committee. But here, in the last 3 years, and actually last year, I guess you would say I had a vision. It came to me. The torch was passed to me. I'm here 50 years later. I'm here to keep Attica and the remembrance of Attica alive and keep the struggle alive.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharif. And thank you to all of the panelists. And I will say that one of the things that gives me hope, there are people rising up behind the walls. There are people rising up in the streets. And we have not seen that at the same time since 1971.
Attica is all of us.
Attica is all of us. Thank you all. Thank you. Good night.
Attica, Attica, what does it mean to stand alone? Attica, Attica, 1,281 souls in the rain and cold. Attica, Attica, another 43 ain't coming home. Attica,